I am a member of the class of '81. I did my master's work here at Springfield in 1982, and I am very privileged to serve our alma mater as the director of Alumni Relations. Working with me in the Alumni House on campus this evening are two people who deserve a huge thanks for this evening. Damon Markowitz, who is our Media Relations Director, and our fabulous Associate Alumni Director, Maria D'Agostino Crawford, class of '91. So I ask you to help me in giving a Zoom round of applause for the two of them because they are just amazing. It is really exciting to have these two true sons of Springfield with us this evening. We have had a great time listening to their wisdom and their expertise as this program has come together. And I think that you're in for a real treat. Just thrilled to have them with us. If you have questions as you hear Drs. Hamill and Oles talking, please put them in the chat. We're going to do our best to get them to them, and they will do their best to get them answered. Certainly any of you that sent questions in ahead of time, they already do, or Dr. Hamill does have those questions. And I also just want to remind you that this program is being recorded so that everybody is aware of that. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening. He is a professor of neurological sciences emeritus in the Department of Neuroscience and chair emeritus for the Department of Neurology at UVM Larner College of Medicine. He is also a Distinguished Alumni Award recipient from Springfield College, an Alumni Council member, and a member of the class of 1964. And for those of you that love Springfield College history, I need to make sure everybody understands that in 1964, Martin Luther King brought to Springfield College by Dr. Glenn Oles, Dr. G. Richard Oles' father, was the commencement speaker while Dr. Hamill was receiving his bachelor's degree. So without further ado, Dr. Bob Hamill.
Tammy, thank you very much. And as you were speaking about Sons of Springfield, Dr. Dick Oles, who will be speaking shortly, we were both on the campus at the same time. And it's exciting to be part of this. And I think everyone will really enjoy the information that will be shared. You've already heard Dr. Oles is the son of Dr. Oles, who is a very highly regarded, inspirational person in certainly the class of 1964's life. Dr. Oles is president of St. George's University in Grenada, and for those of you who may not be familiar with St. George's, it's a highly ranked healthcare institution, and actually in medicine contributes graduates to programs worldwide, and actually fills a fairly high percentage of residency slots here in the United States. And we have had the privilege of having some graduates here at UVM. Dr. Oles trained in medicine at Case Western Reserve and did his internal medicine training at MGH Harvard, and then had a range of experiences in infectious disease, which is his subspecialty interest, including time in Asia and elsewhere in the world, with hands-on experience with infectious disease on a worldwide basis. In addition to his professional expertise in medicine, he's a highly regarded administrator, having served as chair of medicine at the Medical College of Wisconsin, was a founding dean at one of the University of California medical schools before assuming the position at as president of St. George's in Grenada. So without really spending any more time, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Oles. And as you've already heard, as questions come up in your mind, please feel free to share them. We've already had questions submitted by our alumni, and we will I will insert those when the question period comes up. So, Dr. Oles.
Well, thank you, Bob. I suppose for this audience, I think my sister and I have the distinction of being one of the very few people that basically grew up on the Springfield College campus since the President's Home was built and when my father first came there, and then after he left, presidents moved off campus until just recently. So I have a very fond memories of almost 8 years on the Springfield College campus. So today I'm going to be talking about COVID-19, obviously something that most of you have been hearing more than you probably want to hear about on the topic. But I'm going to try to give it a somewhat different perspective. And I think what's important now is to talk about some of the newer developments. And unfortunately, this is an area that has been filled with lots of sort of contradictory statements, et cetera. And I hope that I can try to put some sense into not only what has happened, but what we're going to be doing over the next, let's say, several months. It's a rapidly changing field. Just as an example, since Tammy asked me to do this, I think I've changed my slides 3 or 4 times, so in just several weeks. So, you know, these facts change on a weekly basis, and I'm going to talk a bit about that's led to some confusion because things that we thought were true before are not true now and vice versa. So let's start with the slides. And you'll see that there's some breaks in here where Bob's going to ask me some specific questions. Now, you might wonder why this funny name, Revenge of the Animals? Well, really the reason that I use that is that I'm trying to emphasize the fact that this coronavirus is actually an animal virus that has made the species jumps to humans. And although that may be a new concept for you, this is actually something that has happened a lot over the history of man. So next slide. Now, although not a virus, the Black Death, which by the way was the single pandemic that had the greatest influence on the human population, killing roughly 1/3 of the human beings on this planet, is actually a bacterial infection, but it shares with COVID the fact that this was actually an infection of rats that was transmitted to human beings by fleas. And obviously it wreaked a great deal of havoc on the human population during the Middle Ages. Next slide. Now, this idea though is not necessarily ancient history. And so if we look at just the recent last 100 years, we have had several examples of viral infections, which are principally viral infections of animals that were able to make the species up to humans and cause major epidemics and pandemics. Now, most of you would be aware of the swine flu or Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, but you may not be aware of the fact that the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 80s is really an example of a virus, basically whose original home was the lesser chimpanzee family in Africa that was capable of making the species jump to humans, probably somewhere in the 1950s, and obviously caused a major pandemic that we're still fighting today. Several other examples of monkey or other animal, many times bat viruses that made the species jump to humans. And I'm going to talk more about the last 3, which are the most recent coronaviruses that made the species jump. Now, not all viruses are equally able to make the species jump, but several of them are, if you will, pretty promiscuous. And we've had a history of them, coronavirus obviously being one, influenza being another. These are all examples of viruses. Ebola, I guess, would be a good 3rd example of viruses that basically historically have lived in another animal species, but were able to make the species jump to humans. Next slide. So I want to talk a little about if you will, a intellectual exercise. When a virus that basically its home is in another species is able to successfully jump to human beings, there's an interesting dynamic that develops. If the virus is too rapidly fatal, it's not a very successful human virus. It's scary to us, but you know, when you think about it, it's a little like burning down your home. Viruses cannot live outside of living tissue. And so all the viruses that exist in the world today have been kept alive by their ability to jump from one human or one living thing to another living thing to another living thing. If that chain were ever broken, the viruses would become extinct. So interestingly, there's a dynamic. It's not to the long-term survival advantage of a virus to be rapidly fatal to a host. In fact, the most successful viruses often don't cause serious illness, but are able to jump from person to person or from animal to animal to maintain themselves for literally millions of years. Next slide. I'll try to give you examples of some of these. The common cold is an example of a not terribly dangerous viral infection of humans, but it is a very, very successful virus. And that's because it's able to infect human beings repeatedly. And probably everyone in this audience has probably had multiple common cold infections over the history of their life. And so obviously a very successful human pathogen. On the other hand, some of you may remember Ebola. Ebola, if you read the book, The Hot Zone, was so named because that virus was so hot or so rapidly fatal that it actually was not a very successful human pathogen. For many years, it would have outbreaks in Africa, but it killed people so quickly that it wasn't able to spread in largely separated human populations. And only when Ebola basically emerged in the highly populated areas of West Africa did we have a major worldwide pandemic. So basically, it's not to the virus's advantage to be highly lethal. And in fact, if viruses ever become established in the human host, they often, if you will, downgrade over time, but we're talking about hundreds, even thousands of years, months and days. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit more about the coronavirus. There are 3 animal coronaviruses that have made the species jump to human beings in recent history. That is MERS, which was the Middle Eastern epidemic, SARS, which you may remember came from China and spread all the way in to Canada, and of course COVID-19 today. And when you look at these 3 coronaviruses, they can be separated in the same way. MERS is more rapidly lethal to humans, but was, if you will, the least successful human pathogen. It no longer exists in humans. SARS was less fatal, but was reasonably successful for a period of time, but was controlled by decent public health. And obviously COVID-19, although less lethal than SARS and MERS, has obviously been extremely successful in transmission in the human population. Next slide. Well, for a virus to come from another species into human beings, 2 things have to occur. And those are essential or you don't have an epidemic or pandemic. The first is the virus has to be capable of making the jump from whatever animal species it comes from into human beings, step 1. And then the second step is that virus has to be able to be transmitted from person to person to person, if you will, in order to ultimately cause an epidemic or pandemic. Now, we've had examples of animal viruses that were able to make the first step, but fortunately, we're not able to make the second step. And probably the one you may remember most is the bird flu. The bird flu was a fairly deadly disease that people caught from being around poultry. And it was successful in making the initial jump into human beings, often having a pretty high fatality rate. But it was not successful in subsequent generations to go from person to person to person transmission. And so we never had an epidemic of bird flu because it lacked that second step. Obviously, a virus like COVID-19 was able to do both these things, and that's why we have a pandemic today. Next slide. Now, a couple little facts about the coronavirus. We have human coronaviruses that we, if you will, are all our species. And we've had those viruses for many years. In fact, they are a common virus that causes the common cold. So it's not like we have never seen a member of this family before. All of us have undoubtedly been infected with coronaviruses from childhood, but those are human coronaviruses. Now, these viruses, all of them, have an interesting projection on their surface. This is a molecule that's on the outside, and it's called the spike protein. And if you look at this pictorial representation of the virus, you can see these spikes sticking out from the virus, and that gave the appearance on scanning electron micrograph of being a crown, and that's where the word coronavirus actually comes from. Now, those spike projections are important because every vaccine that we have available to us targets that molecule. And that's because that's the molecule that's used by the virus to attach to human cells and basically initiate infection. Next slide. So let's just look again at those 3 animal coronaviruses that made the species jump to humans. MERS infected the least amount, maybe a few thousand. SARS, not quite 10,000. And obviously we've had hundreds of millions of cases of COVID-19. And as I mentioned, the fatality rate in MERS was much higher than SARS. And the fatality rate for COVID-19 obviously varies by age and a variety of other factors, but it's probably in the 1% to 2% fatality rate range. Now, SARS and MERS, and for that matter, COVID-19, we think all originated in bats, but SARS came to human beings through civet cats, which is a mammal in central China, and MERS came to human beings through an intermediate animal, camels. And we don't yet know today exactly where COVID-19 came from, whether it came directly from bats or it came through some other animal species on the way to humans. All of them have a relatively short incubation period. You may recall that it's a few days and has a maximum incubation period of 2 weeks. That's why that quarantine period comes from. And all of them, interestingly, when humans die of these coronavirus infections, they don't actually die directly from the virus itself, but rather an exuberant immune response that occurs to the virus generally late in the course of the illness. I'll talk about that a little later. It's called acute respiratory distress syndrome, and it's actually driven by cellular hormones that our body releases in response to really significant immunologic stimuli, and that's how people actually end up dying of all of these coronaviruses. Next slide. So there's been a lot of discussion even recently. Where in the heck did this COVID-19 come from? Well, it's pretty clear that it probably originally came from bats. And then the question really is, did it come directly from bats or did it come through some carrier animal, as I'd mentioned? Now, the closest genetic match to the COVID-19 virus is actually a bat virus that was isolated from a cave about 200 miles southeast of Wuhan, China. And it's currently unknown, despite what WHO just said, whether that virus infected a human being directly from bats or whether there's some other animal potentially that was at this wet market in Wuhan, China that may have transmitted the first case into human beings. It is interesting, though, to note that in 2012, some miners that were actually working in the very cave where a COVID-like virus was isolated developed a severe respiratory illness, much like COVID-19, and about half of them died. And the isolates from that epidemic were held at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which, as you may know, some people question whether a lab accident was responsible for the transmission of the disease. I don't know any of those answers, but I will tell you that this was not a virus that was manufactured by human beings. People that manipulate viruses, they leave telltale signs of the molecular footprints, if you will, on the virus. So this is not a virus that has been, despite what you might hear in the, I don't know, whatever you call press or online, this is not a virus that was manufactured or created by human beings. I don't know exactly how it got to humans, but we didn't make it. Next slide. I think this is the question slide. Bob?
Before we go to questions, I do have one very special attendee that needs to be introduced. While we were doing our introductions in the beginning, our 13th president, Dr. Mary Beth Cooper, was able to join us. I don't know how she gets to all the programs she gets to. She is quite amazing, and I just want everybody to join me in thanking Dr. Cooper for being with us this evening.
Oh, thanks.
You want to say hello? There you are.
Yes, just wanted to say hi, everybody. I jumped right on at 7, and I'm delighted to see all these people on Zoom. We have 70 people that are here tonight. As I flip through the screens, it's good to see so many of you. I hope you're all well. And it's nice to see you again, Dr. Old. It's been a number of years since you've been to campus.
Well, thank you. My family all still comment on what a wonderful host you were during during graduation, and I enjoyed immensely my return home, if you will.
Well, you're always welcome, especially now that you're vaccinated. You're more
Yes.
than welcome to come back to campus.
Yeah, I'm fully vaccinated now, guys.
Okay, carry on, everybody. Good to see you all. Thanks, Tammy.
So Bob, you have some questions, I'm sure, at this point. This is not the end of the talk, by the way. We just interrupt it periodically to see if we can answer questions on that.
Right. We had a number of questions submitted, and we've organized them to follow the talk. And I just want to remind everybody, if you can mute your Zoom until you want to certainly ask a question. And of course, send in questions through the chat. So here are a couple of questions, and Dr. Rolls has already alluded to the questions. And one is, the coronavirus, as you say, is a common cold virus, but obviously it became quite deadly. And so something changed with that virus. And a second question came in. We have heard about double mutant strains that have been found in California. What does this mean? So those two questions related to the virus itself.
So the first question is, people say, well, if I've had a coronavirus and it caused a common cold, why is COVID-19 so dangerous, and et cetera? Although these viruses are in the same family, they obviously differ a lot in their ability to infect human beings, in the disease that they cause, and in their ability to make somebody sick or kill them. So the human coronaviruses that we've lived with for millions of years obviously have adapted over very long periods of time, and they do not cause serious disease in human beings. But these viruses, who, by the way, come from other animals, like bats primarily, they don't make the bats sick. The bats are, if you will, have adjusted through millions of years of coevolution to have these viruses infect them and are passed from bat to bat. But when they make that species jump, they often have different characteristics. Now, this happens not infrequently. So if those of you that read Richard Preston's book, The Hot Zone, may recall that even Ebola, which had fatality rates in some cases as 90% fatality rates, was an extremely deadly virus. And then in Renton, Virginia, an Ebola virus was released accidentally through the death of some monkeys in a government research facility, and people panicked that this deadly virus was now exposing human beings, and it turned out that that particular Ebola virus was non-infectious to human beings. So the fact that coronaviruses have a whole spectrum of their ability to make people sick, and by the way, they change all the time. We'll talk a bit more about that when we talk later about the variants. Now, Bob, your second question, which is the new isolates from California, and by the way, there are now new variants that are developing in New York and a variety of other areas. I'm going to talk a bit about that later, but that's part of the natural, if you will, evolution of the virus. This is an RNA virus. I sort of skipped over that since that seems a little too technical. But RNA viruses don't copy themselves as exactly as DNA viruses. And as a result of that, they make, quote, mistakes. And those mistakes turn out to be mutations. And if the mutations make the virus less effective, they're gone. But if they make the virus either more infectious or give it some other property that helps it be a, quote, successful virus, well, then that new mutation tends to overtake the, if you will, lesser fit viruses that are circulating. But I'm going to talk more about that when I talk about the variants at the end. So I think I'll stop there, Bob.
Yeah, one other question had to do with the possibility of an intermediate host in America, largely related to cats and dogs, and whether my Labrador Retriever is at risk.
Well, let me tell you, I mean, as in most of these talks, you got to just know what the truth of the situation is. We don't know all the answers right now, but let me point out that the coronavirus, when it came to Europe, we had a very scary incident where the coronavirus was spread from human beings to minks in a mink farm. Within the minks, it caused a major epidemic in minks. And then mutations took place in the minks, and minks gave the virus in a new form back to human beings that was more lethal. So clearly, it is possible for the virus to go from human beings to an animal species and back to human beings. It's possible to do that. Now, having said that, you may recall that early in the pandemic, the lions and tigers at the New York City Zoo got COVID-19. So clearly, big cats can get COVID-19. And in fact, I think we now know that household cats probably can get COVID-19 from us. We've not had any documentation of a person catching COVID-19 from their pet cat, but you can understand the epidemiology being such, it's not very likely that will happen. It's a little harder to infect dogs. And so, I do not know of any transmission from a dog to a human being, although it is true that some dogs have acquired it from their infected masters, if you will. So it is a concern. I think if I were worried about pets, though, the one pet I'd be really worried about are ferrets. And that's because ferrets are in the mink family. And given the history of what happened in Europe with minks, I think I'd be a little worried about pet ferrets. But besides that, I don't think we have a lot. I think that our pets have more to worry about getting COVID from us than we have to worry that our dogs and cats are going to get COVID, give it to us.
Right. So that's good. We've got some other questions, but I'm going to hold them.
Okay. All right, let's go on to the next slide. We have 4 or 5 of these, by the way, we're stopping. So I think many of you have an image of what COVID is like, and that was based on what our perception of the disease was at the beginning of this pandemic. I already mentioned as a relatively short incubation period, usually about 3 or 4 days. Maximum is 14 days, but that's unusual. Usually people, if you're going to get it, you're going to get it in about a week. The early symptoms are usually respiratory. You usually have a fever, you get a cough, and usually shortness of breath takes several days to develop. The one really characteristic symptom of COVID-19 is the loss of taste and smell. That's about 7% predictive that you've got COVID-19. All the other symptoms, you could have some other virus or the flu or something else, but the one symptom that is really suggestive of COVID-19 was this loss of taste and smell, which is very unusual in other infections. Now, this is a very slowly developing disease. So people get a fever, they're getting a cough, they don't feel very well, but that if you will, milder symptoms then develop over the next week or so, and people get progressively sicker. And ultimately, they are called into the hospital, a smaller group, and those that are hospitalized are often put in an intensive care unit. And then ultimately, people who die of COVID-19 tend to die in the 2nd or 3rd week of infection. So if you will, most people get over the infection. In fact, most people are asymptomatic, but those that are going to have a bad outcome, it plays out over a longer period of time. Now that's in contrast to the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, which, as you may know if you're a historian, killed young adults in 2 or 3 days. But that's not the story of COVID-19. Now, one of the unfortunate things with COVID-19 is, for some reason, people that don't get enough oxygen as a result of the infection in their lungs tend to not know that they don't have enough oxygen. Excuse me. So often people come in not all that short of breath, but they have really scary oxygenation, much lower than we would want to see. And that led to a lot of intubation of patients early in the course of the disease. We now know that that's probably not a good idea. And we've now, by positioning the patient and watching them carefully, but not intubating them, we've reduced the mortality rate for COVID-19 by about 50%. So I already mentioned the rest of these acute symptoms. So let's go on to the next slide, because most people know or think they know what COVID-19 is. But it turns out COVID-19 causes a lot of other symptoms that we didn't appreciate at the beginning of the pandemic. We now know that very young children can have this hyperimmune systemic disease where they have involvement of multiple organs and they have a terrible rash, and they can clearly die of that particular disease. We also know that younger people in their 20s and 30s, may not have any respiratory symptoms at all, but suddenly present with a stroke or some other a pulmonary embolus or some other clot-like disease. And in fact, clots induced by COVID-19 are extremely common and have now led to most people who are hospitalized with this disease are anticoagulated. Now, the other thing that was really sneaky about this is that COVID-19 causes a lot of vascular problems, including cardiac problems, arrhythmias, heart failure, a variety of other conditions. And so early on in the pandemic, a lot of people that we thought were presenting with heart disease were actually presenting with COVID-19. And until we started testing everyone, we didn't realize that. The other sneaky presentation, is in Bob's bailiwick, were neurologic presentations. And they weren't just the strokes that I mentioned before, they were hallucinations and confusion and memory loss. And that turned out to be neurologic complications turned out to be pretty common. About a third of all the COVID-19 patients have some neurologic abnormalities as part of their presentation. Now, the interesting thing about COVID, remember those spike proteins on the surface? They don't just bind anywhere. They bind specifically to a receptor on our blood vessels, in our nose, in our lungs, etc. It's called the ACE2 receptor. Those of you that are on antihypertensive medicine may know that I myself am on an ACE inhibitor. That is the very enzyme on the surface of cells that this virus binds to. Now, probably the most disturbing aspect of the virus that we now appreciate is about a third of people have persistent symptoms. They can have persistent neurologic symptoms, they can have persistent cough, they can have other persistent symptoms that can last months. And some people have had these symptoms that have lasted now for over a year, including such things as chronic fatigue and confusion and clouding memory, etc. So this is a really nasty virus, and it has a lot of unusual presentations. Next slide. Well, this is just a heat map of just the most recent COVID infections. And so you can see it has a spotty distribution over the United States. And despite the fact that we've been fighting this pandemic for over a year, it's obviously resulted in basically millions of deaths worldwide. And we're well over 550,000 deaths in the United States. Now, the one point I want to make here is that these are all real underestimates. I've heard, this, whatever the internet, people talking about the fact that people are overdiagnosing COVID and COVID isn't nearly as bad as people say it is. No. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The infection rate that we know, basically, we believe that probably at least 3 times as many people were infected as we think were infected. And that's because you can only make it in that category if you have a PCR, that's polymerase chain reaction positive test. And we knew we had a lot of problems with testing. And there's some places still in the United States that really don't have very well organized testing. And so these are all gross underestimates. Same thing's true with deaths. People were saying, oh, these people are dying of other diseases. They weren't dying of COVID. No. They're dying of COVID. They just, as I explained in the earlier slide, it's just that COVID has a lot of funny manifestations that we only now appreciate. So early on, particularly in the pandemic, there were a lot of people that died of COVID that never got labeled as a COVID death because they weren't tested before they died. Next slide. So on the next 2 slides, I'm going to talk a little about things that we thought at the beginning and what we know now. Now, I say this because a lot of people remember things from 5 or 6 months ago, and they still think they're true, and they may not be true. And so, this is where a lot of myths develop because they have a certain amount of truth in that they were thought to be true, a year ago. It turns out now that we've actually had a chance to have science look at these questions, they turn out not to be true, but people have hung on to these ideas and act as though they're, still true. They're not true. So we used to think that the only people that were sick were able to transmit the disease. Yeah. That's why we used a lot of these, taking temperatures and, and et cetera as a screening tool. We now know that 40% of the transmission comes from asymptomatic people. These are people who have no symptoms at all. So because of that, you just can't put a rope around this pandemic by looking for people that are sick, have a cough, or have a fever. We used to think that young people didn't have that much to worry about from this virus, and we now know that that's not true. Although the likelihood of younger people dying is much less than people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, for which the mortality rate keeps going up. Clearly, younger people can get quite sick and they can die. And what's also quite disturbing is a lot of younger people can get these long haul symptoms. So despite the fact they didn't die, they could actually have persistent neurologic abnormalities, cardiac abnormalities, coughs, etc. Now, I'll also point out that the new variants, and I'll get to that later, look like they're more deadly, if you will, to younger people. So even if there weren't that many deaths before, the new viruses that are circulating, certainly in the northeastern part of the United States, are clearly more deadly, and they have a higher attack rate and a higher mortality rate in younger people than the original virus that was circulating at the very beginning. Now, we used to think a lot of the transmission was based off infected surfaces. This came from our knowledge of the coronaviruses that cause the common cold. We now know that that's actually a relatively rare event. No, I'm not saying don't continue to use your, alcohol swipes and stuff like that. It's a rare event for a person to get infected from a surface. The vast majority of people get infected from breathing an aerosol that contains the virus. Now, we understand, next slide, I think I talk a bit more about that transmission. People, we used to think were maximally infectious when they were coughing and sneezing, etc. And we now know that people are actually maximally infectious a few days before they get any symptoms at all. This is why this virus is spreading so rapidly, is because people feel fine and they somehow feel empowered to not wear a mask or etc., because they are under the mistaken impression that the only people that are infectious are people that are coughing or sneezing or feeling bad. That is just not true. Now, we used to also think that every person was equally infectious. If you're infected, you're infectious to other people. Well, that's not exactly true. It turns out that only about 20% of the infected population are responsible for about 80% of the transmission. And you can see how this might happen. For instance, a person that has a very high viral titer in their nose and oropharynx is likely to be a whole lot more dangerous to people than a person that has a very low viral count, even if they're both sick and they both are infected. This is also seen in tuberculosis, by the way. There are many people with tuberculosis that themselves are very sick, but they're not infectious to other people. So let's move on to the last thing. We used to know very little about what were the activities, therefore, that transmitted disease. It's pretty clear now. Large groups, indoor bars and restaurants are the most dangerous. And they're the most dangerous because we used to think that the air transmission was in large lipid droplets that fall out of the air at about 3 feet. That's where the 6 feet came from. Well, we now know that about 10% of the virus is in very, very small particles.
Well, let's get that straight with Ruben, and then maybe we could proceed. That would be awesome.
And as a result,
for the call.
Where the air exchange is not rapid, there's a lot of transmission that can take place. And interestingly, the longer you stay in any indoor environment where that's true, the increased likelihood that you're going to get infected. Next slide. Okay, Bob, sounds like there's some questions back there, so
yes,
this is a good time to ask them.
So a couple of questions related. You've already answered some of these that have come in. One is, are there any medications folks can take either over the counter or supplements or lifestyle changes to reduce their risk of infection?
Well, clearly we know that masks are effective in both protecting you, particularly if you have one of the better masks that people are using now. And the most important thing is they clearly interfere with transmission to other people. Now, there's a lot of people that are using zinc and vitamins and other things. Honestly, there's no particularly good studies to show if they work or not, but I'll tell you my own attitude. As long as those are things that are unlikely to hurt you, I don't have any objection for people trying those things as sort of above all do no harm. But I don't know of any scientific evidence that suggests that they work. Now, there are a few things that do work. There's a drug, actually an anti-worm drug called Ivermectin. It has a modest effect, but it has to be taken right away as soon as you develop symptoms. And the other, much more effective, are the monoclonal antibodies. And again, those monoclonal antibodies are maximally effective when they're given very early when people develop symptoms. So there's a big importance for you to get tested and find out if you have COVID-19, because the documented treatments basically have to be given very early. It's very much like influenza. You may remember that Tamiflu, which is effective against many flu strains, has to be given in the first 48 hours of symptoms or it doesn't work. Now, having said that, I can assure you that chloroquine's a bad idea. Not only is there no solid studies to show that it works, but it's dangerous because it has a cardiac toxicity. I'm a tropical disease specialist, and so I know quite well that high doses of chloroquine is a bit dangerous. So please don't use chloroquine. We at least know that is not a good idea. But other things that, like zinc and vitamin C, et cetera, I don't have any objection to people using those. It's just I don't know of any documented evidence that they work.
Right. The general question on the mortality of COVID versus the mortality of the common flu.
Well, COVID is considerably more dangerous. I mean, even though they share the characteristic that older people more commonly die of influenza, and the older people more commonly die of COVID-19, the ratio between those is over 10 times. So, the mortality rate for COVID-19 is about 20 times higher than the mortality rate for influenza. So yes, influenza does kill people, but COVID-19 kills a lot more people. A terrible flu epidemic, which we've had some in our lifetime, has killed quite a few people. But right now, COVID-19 is the third leading cause of death on this planet, after cancer and cardiovascular disease. I mean, influenza is nowhere close to that. So COVID-19 is a much more deadly disease, much more deadly infection than influenza, despite what you may have heard. It's just, that's not factually true.
Another question had to do with, as teachers and coaches working with young people, and especially with the issues related to the possibility of long haul symptoms, any particular suggestions of what else can be done to protect students and athletes? And actually having a grandson who came down with COVID on the football team in New York, and he's been pretty sick. So that's a personal observation.
Well, personally now, I've been very pleased with the pace for which immunizations are getting rolled out. And I would say that I think teachers, especially older teachers and teachers that have comorbid conditions, clearly need to be vaccinated. But the issue around going back to school and specific outdoor activities or activities like sports, I think you have to be more specific about what it is. So let me explain my position there. It turns out that younger children in grade school, if they wear masks and they have some socially distancing, that's studied. If everybody's wearing a mask in that environment, there is not that much transmission that takes place in those younger kids. So that is the reason why people were recommending going back to school in those younger age groups. And I'll also point out that those are the very groups that are probably most disadvantaged from online learning. Now, on the other hand, high school students really behave, in a sense, from an infectious disease standpoint, a lot more like college students. And here, the transmission that's taking place in those age groups is largely not from being in school. It's largely from the ubiquitous social activities of those individuals, certainly in college campuses and in high schools. Most of the transmission is taking from the social activity of the student, not from actually attending school. Now, if you're involved in sports, this is a little trickier because obviously some sports are considerably less risky than other sports. So all outdoor sports are considerably safer than indoor sports. And indoor sports are safer if there's a good deal of distance that takes place between the various people involved in the sport. So you can imagine that really on the very worrisome scale, if you're a wrestler, you're in pretty close proximity to the person you're wrestling with, and it's indoors, et cetera. That would be the kind of activity that, I think it would be prudent to try to get all those people immunized. And on the other hand, if you're playing an outdoor sport where you have not nearly as much contact between players, that would be on the safer end of that spectrum. Now, of course, people say, well, you know, they don't have immunizations for children. Well, that's rapidly changing. Already, Pfizer has done the study down to 16, and they just published another trial down to age 12. And so I'm reasonably confident. By the way, 12 to 16, it works great. It's 100% effective, and they did not observe any serious side effects. I'll talk a little bit about side effects of vaccine later in that age group. So, you know, it's looking to me like we're going to be easily able to vaccinate down to 12 once the vaccine's available. And right now, both Pfizer and Moderna are in the process of testing 6 months to 2 years of age and 2 years to 12. So I'm pretty sure that we're going to be in a position to have childhood immunizations, certainly I hope by the end of the summer, so that this will become a moot question. Basically, everybody should be immunized, and then you know, it'll make it a lot easier to go back to normal, if you will.
Okay, we should move on.
Okay, next slide. All right, so here's probably what most people have been talking about all the time are the actual vaccines. Now, these are the 7 vaccines that, you know, will reasonably be around to talk about. Really, only 6 of them have completed their phase 3 trial. The Novavax vaccine, I don't know why they have not published their phase 3 trial, but they haven't yet. So I'm really only going to talk about the other 6. 3 of them are approved in the United States, and so I'm going to focus on those. The first 2 that were subjected to double-blind placebo-controlled trials were the 2 so-called messenger RNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. And those both require 2 doses, one 3 weeks apart, one 4 weeks apart, and they're extremely effective vaccines. I'll talk a bit more about what these statistics mean. The big drawback of those vaccines is they have to be stored in very, very low cold temperatures, which make it difficult to distribute those through you know, shopping malls and pharmacies, et cetera, because they don't have the capacity to store those vaccines in 70. Now, Astrazeneca has gotten a lot of press because this was the vaccine developed in conjunction with Oxford University in England, and it's the principal vaccine that's been used in Europe and through England, certainly. And that's been much in the news lately. I'll talk a little bit more about that. That's a little different vaccine. That's a Chimpanzee Adenovirus, which is non-pathogenic in humans, and it's had the sequence for that spike protein inserted into it. So when your body basically reacts to that chimp adenovirus, it also creates antibodies against the spike protein, which protects you. And then the newest one here in the United States is the Johnson & Johnson Jensen vaccine, which is a human adenovirus. It has the big advantage of only requiring a single vaccine, and it gives reasonable protection in a short period of time, and it doesn't need to be stored at -70. So it's the vaccine that's much more likely to make it into a drugstore near you, and that's approved for the United States. The other ones that are out there is the Chinese vaccine, which is an old technology, a killed virus vaccine, and the Russian or Sputnik vaccine, which is another human adenovirus vaccine, very similar to Johnson & Johnson, except it requires 2 shots. And I'm a little more reluctant to quote the statistics on protection on those vaccines, because they haven't been subjected to the same scrutiny as our vaccines are. Can I have the next slide? So I think it's important. There's been a lot of misunderstanding about these statistics. So let me go over these, because you hear these statistics quoted all the time, and I'm not sure everybody understands what they mean. Protection means different things. If you're talking about protecting somebody from getting infected at all, that's one statistic. And that statistic hasn't really been known until fairly recently, because that requires people to basically test everyone that's got the vaccine and everyone that got the placebo every week with a PCR to see if they get infection at all. The statistic that most people are quoting is preventing disease, preventing people from getting sick. And that's an important statistic, but that's the 95% for the messenger RNA. That's the 71 to 80% for the J&J vaccine. That is the ability of that vaccine compared to a sugar water injection to prevent disease, people getting sick. But really the statistic that's most important in this pandemic is preventing hospitalization and death. Sure, I'd like people not to get sick, but that's not the most important statistic. The most important statistic is preventing hospitalization and death. And here the good news is all these vaccines are very, very effective in preventing hospitalization and death. So, having said that, there's really, people say, well, which vaccine should you get? Get the one you can get. They all are very effective in preventing hospitalization and death. And I would never recommend you delay getting a vaccine to quote, get a better one. That probably doesn't make sense given the fact that you can get infected in that interval. Now, there's a couple other misconceptions about the vaccine. We know the virus varies in its ability to kill people by age. We've already talked about that. But interestingly, in contrast to the flu vaccine, for which older individuals are often not as well protected by the vaccine as younger individuals, that all the vaccines that we're using are equally protective of older people as they are of younger people. So all the reason in the world to get the vaccine. The other interesting variation is we know that COVID-19 does discriminate by race and ethnic groups, et cetera. African Americans and Hispanic individuals, Native Americans have a much higher hospitalization and mortality rate. There's a lot of factors associated with that, but there is a lot of virus-induced variation. But in these studies, there was sufficient numbers of people of those ethnic backgrounds to know that all of them are protected by the vaccine. There's no variation in the induced protection in those various racial groups. And that's, again, all the reason in the world to get the vaccine. Next slide, Bob. Okay, so let's go over some of the other things that always come up in these discussions. Well, what about the short-term and long-term side effects? Now here it's very important to remember the best way, and honestly, almost the only way to be sure about stuff is with a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. In that kind of a trial, neither the doctors nor the patients know whether they got the actual vaccine or whether they got sugar water, and they don't know until the end of the study. And this was done in about 70,000 people with the messenger RNA vaccines and another 40,000 people with the J&J vaccine. Those are the three available in the United States now. There was no statistical difference in any long-term side effect between those that actually got the vaccine and those that got sugar water. Now that's an incredibly safe vaccine from a long-term toxicity standpoint. I'll talk a bit more about some of these newer concerns that were raised, but they were not in a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. That's when people develop a complication near when they got a vaccine, and then you've got to sort out, is that due to the vaccine or is it just a rare event that would have happened anyway? Now on the short-term side, there are a lot of short-term side effects, a sore arm, feeling crummy for a day, feeling fatigued. There are a fair amount of short-term side effects. The good news is that those are all really short-term. Most people can take some ibuprofen or some Tylenol and they're over it in about 24 hours. And those short-term side effects are often worse with the second shot than the first shot, but they're short-term side effects. The only really serious short-term side effect is anaphylaxis. That's a very severe immune reaction to the vaccine. And here the good news is that happens very quickly. It occurs in the first 5 or 10 minutes after you get the vaccine. And that's why all of you that got the vaccine had to sit around and wait for 15 minutes. Because if you had that reaction, they would give you a shot with epinephrine, so-called EpiPen, and it would correct the problem. And you probably would be recommended not to take the vaccine again. But that short-term serious side effect, it only occurs about 1 or 2 cases per million. So that's a really rare side effect, but we still take the precaution of watching people for 15 minutes. Now, all these vaccines appear to prevent disease with the virus, but when some people will still get infected despite being vaccinated, but the good news is they tend to have milder disease. And interestingly, what we've learned just in the last couple of weeks, they tend to have lower titers of virus in their noses. So vaccinated people are probably also less likely to transmit the disease to other people. Now, they're still studying that, but I think that's an important public health aspect of vaccination, is it obviously keeps you from being hospitalized, keeps you from dying, very effective in keeping you from getting sick. But even if you do become infected, you're probably less infectious to other people than if you weren't vaccinated. All the reasons in the world, therefore, to get vaccinated. Now, it is still possible that a vaccinated person can transmit the disease, even though it's less likely. I just said that. So until everybody has at least an opportunity to get vaccinated, people are still asked to wear their masks and socially distance and do those things, because we don't want to be transmitting the disease until everybody has had a chance to be vaccinated. And that's not yet occurred, but that's probably only a couple months down the road. So, you know, that's going to be the time when we can stop sort of doing all these public health precautions. But that time, by the way, is not now. This is not the time to not wear a mask. This is not the time to not socially distance. This is not the time to go to indoor bars and restaurants because unfortunately, there are still a lot of people out there that haven't been vaccinated. Now, there has been a lot of concern raised about the Astrazeneca vaccine. Now, let me just say from the very beginning, that vaccine is not available in the United States. So let's keep that in mind. The Astrazeneca vaccine, after it was released in Europe, there were rare cases of unusual types of clotting and bleeding disorders that occurred. Now, in those double-blind placebo-controlled trials, there was no increased risk of clotting at all in any of the vaccines, including the AstraZeneca vaccine. And by the way, the disease COVID-19 causes a lot of clotting. So the disease you're trying to prevent it definitely causes a lot of clotting in most people. The two conditions that they were worried about is a blood clot basically in the veins draining the brain, and in something called idiopathic thrombocytopenia, basically low platelet counts. In both cases, these occurred about 1 in a million. So they're very rare occurrences. And today, we really don't know whether this is just the background reactivity of this disease or whether it was caused by the vaccine. But it has led Canada, since all of these rare occurrences occurred in women under the age of 55, Canada has decided not to use that vaccine in people under the age of 55 and use the other vaccines. And Europe temporarily stopped using that vaccine until they had a better feel for whether it was causing a problem or not. But right now, that vaccine is still being used through most of the world, but not in the United States. And again, this is a rapidly changing area. We'll probably know more in a few weeks, but this is what we know today. Next slide. All right, Bob, this is usually where we get a lot of questions. So,
you know, that's exactly. I'll start off with one question came in on if a person has had a swollen lip, some hives related to COVID itself, and maybe even some angioedema. Is that a red flag for getting vaccinated?
well, probably not, but it does point out the fact that a lot of the things that people are concerned about, you don't want to get COVID-19. This is not a good disease. And by the way, that reaction with the skin reaction, et cetera, that's the syndrome that's seen in very young children, but it occasionally occurs in adults. So it's a reaction to the viral infection itself. I wouldn't, if it's not an anaphylactic reaction, and anaphylactic is a rapid difficulty breathing, et cetera, I would say that that would not be an indication to not be vaccinated. And it actually points out the importance of getting vaccinated because you don't want to get COVID-19. And by the way, even people who have had COVID-19 still need to be vaccinated. And that's because the vaccine is not only more effective, but the protection induced by the vaccine is both stronger and lasts longer. So even if you've had COVID-19, you still should be immunized.
Yeah, I would only add, we had a friend's daughter who's had a similar high risk event, and we just made sure that where she got vaccinated, was in a setting where the physicians, there were physicians there, and B, they knew of the risk ahead of time, sort of preventative. The question on, is there any danger for young people who might want to have a baby in the near future if they get the vaccine? Does it affect fertility? Does it affect spermatogenesis? And in the same vein about women who are already pregnant.
Yeah, this comes up quite a bit. I bet you I've been asked this question numerous times. So, and you know, it's interesting. I'm not exactly sure where that concern came from. It may have come from the scare, well, the legitimate concern around Zika, for instance. So that may have been where it originally came from. But there's no evidence that the vaccine interferes with fertility. And so, on the other hand, I can tell you that COVID-19 is really bad if you're pregnant because it has a higher mortality rate in pregnant women. Because as you may know, in pregnancy, the woman is modestly immunosuppressed in order to not reject the fetus. And so pregnant women are often much more, suffer much more severe viral infections than their age-matched, not pregnant cohorts. The other thing is that stillborn deaths are more common following COVID infection. So there's a significant risk to the unborn child of the virus that we're trying to protect you against. So although the general recommendation is to talk to the advice of your OBGYN, which I think is always a good idea, I can tell you that this very question came up with my daughter-in-law, who is about 6 weeks pregnant, and I strongly recommended that she go ahead and get vaccinated. Now, the one personal caveat, and this is not based on any research or science, but if my daughter-in-law was going to get vaccinated, I would use the messenger RNA vaccine. And that's because the messenger RNA vaccine does not contain a virus of any kind. On the other hand, the Johnson & Johnson and the Moderna vaccines, those actually have a virus carrier. And although there's no evidence that I know of that there's a danger associated with that, it seems to me if you had an alternative of getting a messenger RNA vaccine rather than a viral carrier vaccine, given the fact that this has not been studied carefully, I'd probably get the messenger RNA vaccine. But having said that, I certainly think it's a good idea to get vaccinated. The other good news about doing that is remember that if you as the mother are vaccinated against COVID-19, you pass that protection on to your child before they're born and for 6 months after they're born. And if you breastfeed, you pass on protection of that breastfeeding child for about 6 or 7, maybe another year. So there's a lot of reasons to get vaccinated in that setting. And there is no evidence to suggest that there's a downside to being vaccinated. My only caveat is I'd use the messenger RNA vaccines, not a live virus. And that's just a personal opinion.
Is there any risk for someone who might be asymptomatic and carrying the virus to get vaccinated?
No, it doesn't seem like that's the case. There theoretically, it's not a risk of side effects. Theoretically, the vaccine might not be as effective. And that's why originally people said that if you were infected with COVID-19, you should wait 2 weeks before you're immunized. That's due to a condition called viral interference. That's why measles, mumps, rubella vaccine is given together, not separately. You're not going to know whether you're asymptomatically infected or not. So there's no downside to it, meaning side effects or others. It may just not be as effective a vaccine, but most of these vaccines you're getting 2 doses anyway. So I think you'll be adequately immunized even if you had an asymptomatic infection.
So we had a question submitted by an alumnus, a very detailed question actually, that had to do with a physician publicizing in quite some detail, including videos, pointing out that getting vaccinated was just a terrible idea. It might manifest in 1 to 4 years, possibly producing Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and it went on and on. And it reminded us of sort of the anti-vaxxer world. I think it's something that we want to get out to everybody, that it's the source of information has to be trustworthy. And I wonder, Dick, if you could comment some more about that. We briefly shared emails.
Well, I did go online and read all that stuff. And here's a physician, we're physicians telling you, don't just believe stuff because the person's a physician. There's some pretty crazy people have MD degrees after their name. And I think that, you got to go with the preponderance of evidence. And ultimately, it's not just a single person like myself or Bob saying something, but it's, medical professionals, especially specialists in infectious disease in general. What I had a lot of trouble, and you can usually sniff out these issues, is that the statistics were completely wrong. I mean, it's not, they're false. The statement was made that the vaccine is so much more dangerous than getting COVID-19. Oh, that's ridiculous. If you believe anything I've told you today, please believe me that COVID-19 is not a good thing you want. It's a bad virus. It's killed, millions of people around the world. And to date, this vaccine, the vaccines we're using, are far safer and more effective than most of the vaccines we've used for 30 or 40 years. I mean, these are really effective vaccines. And quite frankly, they're incredibly safe. They're actually safer than some of the vaccines we don't seem to think much about. So, when people make that kind of a statement, it kind of throws out everything else they say. And, they're using the fear mongering that something bad's going to happen in 4 or 5 years, there's no way I can disprove that since we haven't had the vaccines in people for 4 or 5 years. But remember, it's not a difference between should I get the vaccine or not. You're trying to prevent getting COVID. And I can assure you that COVID-19 is a heck of a lot worse than any theoretical side effect from the vaccine.
One of the queries, Dick, that comes up has to do, I'm worried about getting genetic material injected.
Well, that's good that you brought that up. So for instance, genetic material is DNA, okay? There's no DNA in any of these viruses. So, and clearly the messenger RNA vaccines are really clever. Think about this. This is how your genetic material keeps you alive. Your genetic material is in DNA in the nucleus of your cells, and it's got to get out and tell the rest of the cell what it's supposed to do. So it makes messages called messenger RNA that come out of the nucleus. They attach to little protein factories called ribosomes, and amino acids are used to assemble proteins, which are most of what living things how they work. And so that message is basically what the vaccine is. It's giving the message into the cell without it coming out of the nucleus. The nice thing about that is messenger RNA molecules don't last very long. You don't want your cells to be producing the same thing from birth to death. They only last for a week or so. So none of the material in those messenger RNA vaccines are going to last more than a couple of weeks. So that's the good news. The other thing is these are all RNA viruses, and RNA viruses in general can't go back into DNA. Now, there is a couple exceptions. Those are called retroviruses, like the viruses, and none of these fall into that category. So there's no genetic material in any of these vaccines. So this concern that it's going to insert something into your genes, it's just not theoretically possible.
So we should move on.
Okay.
We'll say I've got some questions. I'll put them toward the end.
Okay, next slide. So there's no question we've had some issues with vaccine distribution. Obviously, this was a huge problem in the beginning. But listen, I'm very proud of what's happening right now. Listen, I think we did 4 million immunizations last week in a day. So we're starting to get that fixed. I am saddened by the fact that we really haven't had a national plan. And so, states vary a great deal by how efficiently they're distributing the vaccine, how efficiently they're keeping their disease managed. Both Bob and I are in Vermont right now, and I'm proud to say Vermont's been a great state to be in because it's been very well managed. And on the other hand, there are states that have not managed this well. And a couple states, Alabama and Mississippi, are way behind in immunizing their population. And just recently, you probably recall that the Johnson & Johnson threw a lab mistake, they lost, I don't know, 20 or 30 million doses. Now, the good news about that story is obviously there's a lot of quality control because none of those ever made it out into people's arms. They basically threw away all those vials. So, this is pretty strictly controlled, certainly in our country. So I think we're getting there, but it's taken a Herculean effort. And I think probably within a month or two, everybody that wants to get a vaccine is going to be able to get a vaccine. And then we're going to be left with the people who are going to refuse to get vaccines. And that's going to be our real challenge come summer, I think. Next slide. Okay, so the variants are obviously the other big wild card that people didn't appreciate. So let me just start by saying, although you've just recently heard about variants, variants have been taking place in COVID-19 from the very beginning. You may recall way, way back, the West Coast of the United States was infected with a COVID-19 that was virtually identical to the one that was in Wuhan, China. On the East Coast of the United States, we were infected with a COVID-19 virus that was different. It was a variant, and it had basically mutated when it was in Europe, and we imported into the East Coast of the United States a altered virus that was not the same as what took place in China. So obviously, we've had variants out there from the very beginning. Now, by definition, there's a lot of variants that were not more infectious. They all died off because they weren't successful. But those new variants that are more infectious, if you will, overpopulate the original strain because they're more effective in infecting human beings. So by definition, almost all these new variants are more infectious. Now, what's a little more concerning is some of these new variants actually cause more severe disease. And you've probably now seen studies with the so-called English mutation, the 117 mutation, actually causes more severe disease. And this is particularly problematic now as younger people are getting infected with COVID-19. They're having a higher hospitalization and mortality rate because it's not with the same virus that we had at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, what's good news is all the vaccines that we currently are using today, they're all going to work against all the current variants. So that's the good news. The bad news is that over time, if we don't get everybody vaccinated, these variants are going to keep developing. And if you will, Darwinian logic would suggest that eventually one of these variants is going to get around the protection induced by the vaccine. So the good news is the vaccine producers are already looking at how we can basically develop booster shots based on any new variants as they develop. If you think about it, it's exactly what we have in influenza. Most of you may not know this, but your immunization with the influenza shot every year lasts more than a year. It's just that the virus itself changes from year to year. And so we reformulate that flu vaccine every single year. And heck, we may end up doing the same thing with COVID-19. Now, several of these newer strains, the South African and Brazilian strain, already begun to get around monoclonal antibody treatments. So we know that that's a concern. My sense is let's get vaccinated as fast as we can now. And if in the future a new mutation develops, we at least have the technology so that all of us can get booster shots against whatever new variant develops and starts circulating in the world. Next slide. Well, what have we learned about past pandemics? Let's come back to a little bit of history. Well, every pandemic that we've had historically, we've tended to stigmatize sections of the population. When syphilis was introduced by Christopher Columbus's crew into Europe, it was the French disease in Italy, it was the Italian disease in France, it was the Spanish disease in England, etc. So, now everybody's, I'm sure you're all well aware of this horrible stigmatization of people of Asian descent as though they had something to do with this virus. And I think that's a very unfortunate consequence of what's happening. Now, important to remember that vaccines and drugs alone are not going to control this epidemic. We still have to use good public health measures, et cetera. And in fact, if we'd done a better job with public health measures, we wouldn't have probably not had 200,000 or 300,000 additional deaths in the United States. And let me try to emphasize this one point. Politicians and scientists, they got to be on the same page. This has hurt us probably more than anything else, and it's hurting us right now, is that somehow you know, people just can't understand what science is telling us. Listen, science is going to get us out of this mess if we just listen to what's going on and study what it is and do a better job next time than we did today. But once politicians get involved, that has been really, I think, one of the take-home messages of this tragic saga. And let me just end by saying that we have to be more careful on our borders about importation of disease. This won't be the last pandemic we get. And Europe and Asia are much better at this than we are. Virtually all those airports have temperature measures that can measure elevated temperature in masses of people. We didn't have any of this stuff because we're all focused on security. For us is all focused on Al-Qaeda and terrorists. So let me tell you, Mother Nature is a lot more dangerous than terrorists can be. And if you ever needed better evidence of that, just take a look at this pandemic we're living through. Next slide. So this is my concern. I made this slide about 2 weeks ago, and I'm afraid this is coming true, but I'll at least point it out again. You know, people have lifted the public health precautions prematurely in some states. You know, my family, a lot of them live in Texas. I'm just appalled by them eliminating mask rules, et cetera, before, you know, it's too, you know, before it's really warranted. Less than 20% of the population is fully immunized. We're nowhere close to herd immunity yet. Vaccinated people think they can go back to pre-pandemic activities. Please don't do that yet. You still, although much reduced, you can still transmit this disease. And some people think that we're already, because a lot of people, quote, are vaccinated, that now there's some kind of herd immunity out there. I can assure you it's not out there yet. And the variants that are circulating now are much more infectious and, quite frankly, are more dangerous than the ones that were circulating several months ago. So this is not the time to have all these things happen. And you can see that we're very likely to have yet another spike in hospitalizations and deaths as a result of us, again, not managing this situation any better than we did through all last year. Next slide. So what can I recommend that each of you do in the next several months? Well, I know everybody has pandemic fatigue, but please keep social distancing, keep wearing your mask, limit your travel, avoid indoor bars and indoor restaurants until everyone that wants the vaccine gets an opportunity to get a vaccine. Continue to do all these things even after you're vaccinated. Get vaccinated as soon as your group is allowed to vaccinate, and that's going to be everyone here in another 2 or 3 weeks. And even if you've had COVID-19, please go and get vaccinated anyway. It gives you better protection and longer lasting infection. Natural, quote, immunity is not nearly as solid as vaccine-induced immunity, and it probably only lasts 4 to 6 months. So get vaccinated anyway. And if you get sick, as you probably know, call your doctor to find out how you get tested. Don't go into the waiting room or emergency room because you're trying not to transmit the disease. But it's important that you get tested right away because some of those early treatments, like monoclonal antibodies, only work in the first 48 hours. And the good news is, listen, we only probably got a few more months to go. So things are going to be a lot better by summer if we can just get some rationality in what everybody's doing. Next slide. I think this is my last slide. It is. So here's the last of my question slides. So at this point, I'll try to answer any questions that any of you have. This kind of ends my talk, and I do appreciate you all listening to this long summary of the pandemic that has just crippled our country for the last year and a half. Bob?
I think Dr. Cooper may have a comment. Dr. Cooper?
Certainly. First of all, this was amazing. Dr. Hamill, you did a beautiful job. I mean, you should run a podcast. We'd get together every Wednesday night at 7 o'clock if you could introduce us to topics similar to this. I mean, this was probably the best hour and a half I've spent in weeks because of the content. You answered every question as if you knew exactly where we're going to go. And maybe so many of us have similar questions, but in some ways I feel more comfortable and a little bit more rest assured. And at this other time, I also feel a little bit more scared. So if that was your intent, you were successful in educating, but also giving us concern. And we have a lot of things coming up. And again, as I look at the participant list, it's so nice to see the Flens and Coach Potter. I mean, I could start listing all the people I see on my Zoom screen, but it's just really lovely to see so many of our community come out and want to educate themselves so they can do the right thing, not only for themselves, but for their families and for their communities. And so I want to thank Tammy for pulling this together. And again, Bob and Dick, I mean, it's been delightful. I want to thank you for sharing your resources with us. It has just been a wonderful, wonderful evening. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. And that's it, Dr. Hamill.
Well, thank you very, very much. We've enjoyed doing this, and it was personally, I can say it was great to meet Dick via the Zoom and talking and developing this. A question, Dick, that really results again back to the evolving mutations and infectious characters, and the likelihood we might be looking at boosters in 6 to 8 months as the molecular biology of these viruses is better clarified.
Well, you'd like to think that we could get everyone in the world vaccinated quickly, and since the virus has to replicate in order to create mistakes, if you will, or mutations, you've heard this analogy, it's a race between getting everybody immunized and the virus spitting out mutations, one of which could basically get it around the vaccine. Now, having said that, let's be realistic. We're not going to get 100% people vaccinated in the United States, especially given what's now become, unfortunately, a political issue rather than a public health issue. And let me just tell you, the United States is way out in front of anybody else. So, you know, even other countries, just look to the north in Canada. Canada's way behind us. Many European countries are way behind us. So, and there's virtually no vaccinations in Africa, and South America is having a terrible problem with, as they enter their winter season, they're having a terrible problem, and there's going to be real havoc in South America from COVID. So I think the likelihood that a mutation develops, given how much transmission of the virus is going to take, even outside the United States, I think that we better be preparing for that likelihood. Now, the good news is that these technologies allow us to basically substitute a mutated spike protein for the one that they're using now, and they're already testing that hypothesis with the British mutation. And although the British mutation is currently well protected by the current vaccines, the fact that they can already anticipate that and looked at how they can implement that and wrap and wind it up, it will probably take at least 3 or 4 months for a new viral formulation to go from laboratory to actually getting shots that people can get. But listen, it's impressive how fast we got these vaccines up and running. And by the way, with no shortcuts. People keep saying this all happened way too quickly. Actually, every step that was taken by every other vaccine that the world has seen was done in these cases. It's just that they actually were able to truncate the speed for 2 reasons. One, they simultaneously did animal testing and human testing, and normally you do animal testing for a year before you do human testing. And a lot of the preliminary work was done in the fight against Ebola. And so all those naysayers that said, why are we wasting money on an African Ebola pandemic? Well, that came back to really help us, because this technology was developed actually during the fight over the Ebola pandemic.
I just want to maybe make a general comment that I just remember as a medical student, I had trouble understanding these viruses because they really weren't living separately in life. They were, and so someone said, well, how do you kill a virus? And I remember saying, well, they're not really alive. And Dick, you've alluded to it, they have to live in a host. And the fact, the public health measures remain so fundamentally important. And as you've heard over and over again as an audience, even though we've gotten vaccinated and Vermont's done well, we Today, I see we have the Brazilian variant's been identified in Vermont. So these viruses move so quickly across the population, and preventive measures still remain number 1 through 10, so to speak. Any other questions out there? I think I got most of them. I apologize if I missed any, but I think we should be good. Any last questions?
I think we're good. I cannot thank the two of you enough for your wisdom and your kindness and your time. And Dr. Cooper, thank you for being here with us this evening, and just so great to see all of you. And I truly hope that all the public health measures kick in, and the next time we see each other, it's in person, home here at 263 Alden Street.
Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you, Tammy.
Have a great day, everybody, or great evening.